Hey, I'm Julie Lerman. I am a Docker captain, and I'm going to talk to you about using databases in Docker containers, but from the perspective of developers. I'm a developer of many decades, not a DBA, not a DevOps guru. And the reason I like to share this is because this is what I did the first time I saw SQL Server running in a Docker container. It was pretty amazing. So why, as a developer, would you want to use SQL Server in Docker container? So the first thing is, going back to that reaction. When you spin up an instance, when you spin up a container, SQL Server is right there. I mean, it takes 20 seconds for SQL Server to start up. The container starts instantly. So that's way better than installing SQL Server on your development machine or setting up, a new machine for maybe a new dev who's coming in on your team. You can also, instead of just using the base image, you can create your own image where you've configured the server or already built up databases that are in that container. So you can distribute that pretty easily as well through Docker containers or through Docker images. And if you need to test against multiple versions of your database, you can do that within your one Docker engine. You can run many instances of different containers. So you can have different versions of your database, like SQL Server, in different containers. And you can, get rid of the containers and create a brand new version of it, clean off all the junk that might be on there from some of the testing that you're doing. There are all kinds of reasons to do that. So my focus was SQL Server. That's something I've been using for years and years. And in SQL Server 2017, Microsoft created SQL Server for Linux, which meant, along with being able to run it on Linux, you could run it on Docker and all the different standard and developer and express and enterprise SKUs that you could use. And SQL Server 2019 also, it continues. It started in 2017. They also created Windows containers of SQL Server, and those were in beta for a really long time. And just recently, this year, like a month ago, they finally said, well, we're going to suspend the SQL Server on Windows containers for the foreseeable future. So we'll see how that goes. So with one image of SQL Server, you don't have to have different images for the different editions that you might want to use. It's just a matter of specifying which edition you want to use as you're running the container. So the developer edition is the default, so you don't have to specify that. And of course, developer and express don't need licenses. And you can actually run SQL Server in a container in production, but if you do that, you do need to have your license, and also for standard or enterprise. So it's important to know that Microsoft moved all their images over to their own repository. So those are all at mcr.microsoft.com, including the one for MS SQL Server. However, you still go to hub.docker.com, so Docker Hub, to find out the basics. So, it's that common resource, right? So you go to Docker Hub and you can read all about the details, but the actual image lives physically on Microsoft's repository. And if you're looking for support, there's a GitHub repository for the Docker image. And so you can read through or submit issues there if you need some help, or on Twitter. The team is on there. So unfortunately, you can't just use an IDE like Docker Desktop, say you've got your image on your machine already, and then just run it, right? Like, click on the image and then click on run. That's because we have to pass into important environment variables. The first is to accept the license. That's always the same. And the second is you have to specify a password for the SA login. And the password does have some specific rules. I think this stupid one I have in my example it will pass muster. Also, SQL Server by default exposes itself on port 1433. So internally, which is the second parameter, I'm specifying that it should be on port 1433, but externally on the host, you can surface that on whatever port you want. By putting it as 1433, then it's just default, and you don't have to specify a port. And I also just want to point out that most often, as I'm in development, I do run it interactively so that I can access it through the command line or a tool or something like that. So I'm always using the D parameter to make sure it's interactive when I'm doing that. So let's take a quick look. So I'll have to run it from, in this case, from the command line. And so here is my command. I've got the EULA. I've got my new password. I'm exposing it on port 1601 of the host. And I've given it the name SQL Server 01. So the container is already running. And what's happening on the inside is that SQL Server is spinning up, and it's got all its own SQL script inside of the image that it's running. And I also know that by the time it hits this last message, the tempdb database has 2 data files, that's done. So it takes seconds to start it up and have a running server. That's my, oh my God, I can't even believe that was so fast reaction instead of installing SQL Server, much less that I've got this running on Mac OS. So once that exists, now I can interact with it just like I interact with any other database, right? It's just a matter of having the connection string. So here's Azure Data Studio. I can add the server. Now I've got that on 1601. So I can just do local host, comma, 1601, and then put in my username, SA, password. Let's see if that's it. Oh, I'm going to remember the password. And aha, yay, there it is, running. So now I can interact with this. I can go ahead and create a new database, Docker all hands. I can do anything I can do to any SQL Server database from any application, from the CLI, from my software, right? I can just do that. So I'll just go ahead and refresh and, oh, look, there's my database. So I really think there's not much to be said for the fact, beyond the fact that, hey, I've got a connection string to a database and now I can work with it. But the beauty is, if I wanted to, for one reason or another, I could go up and spin up another one. And I'm going to just rename it here. And it has to be on another port, on another host port. So I'll make that 1602. And I'll give it its 20 seconds. Containers, there's 02. Clearing temp, there it is, tempdb. And also I can see here, right, that it's exports. The first one's exposed on 01, the second one's exposed on 02. And I go back to Data Studio, create another connection. And this is local host, comma, 1602, SAP, ORD1. Cross my fingers that I got it right again. Yes, I got it right again, right? So boom, 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 right? Now I've got 2 servers running on my little MacBook. No big deal. It is no big deal. That's what's so super cool about this. There's something really important you need to know about what I just did, which is I created that Docker all hands database inside the container where my SQL Server is running. So if I wanted to get rid of the container, then the database and all its data will go away along with that. And that might be fine for running a test, right? Spin up the database server, on the fly, create some data, do some work, run your tests, and then shut the whole thing down because you don't need the data anymore, right? So that's fine. But what if you do need the data? You need to be aware that if you stop the container, then that's fine because when you start the container, that database will still be there. But if you get rid of the container, then you're going to get rid of the data also. So it's important to also know how to persist your data if you don't want to have the servers running constantly, which is not an uncommon thing. So one way to do that is to create a data volume and store the data and the databases inside that data volume. So they're like it's almost like a separate container. And so you can, with this syntax where I'm specifying v SQL volume and where it should go, where the actual files will go inside this new volume, which is what that path specifies. So that's going to spin up automatically or look for a volume named SQL volume. So let's see what that looks like to work with. So now I'm creating a new instance and it's being exposed on port 1603, and this time I'm specifying that it should have a volume, which I've named SQL volume, and the name of the container is SQL with volume. So that's already up and running. And here's the container, SQL with volume, and here's the volume. And I can actually click on this and open up the Data tab in Docker Desktop. And I just want to point out that the Data tab is not available if you've got the personal free subscription. But you can always see this like in the CLI or elsewhere. But I'll go ahead into Azure Data Studio. I'll connect to the new server. Connect. And then create a new database. I'll call it db in volume. Run that. Fresh. There it is. Okay, now I'm going to go kill the container 1603. Delete it, remove it completely. And then I'm just going to run this docker run command again. So it's going to look for a volume named SQL volume. If it doesn't find it, it will spin up a new one. And I'll do it on a new port just to really prove that it's there. Okay, the container has started. And here's 1604. And aren't you happy I'm not trying to install SQL Server and make you wait for that? So now I need to connect to 1604, localhost 1604, and once again, connect. And cross your fingers, there it is. So there's the database that lives in the volume. I killed the server and brought the server back again and attached it to the volume, and it's still there. So that's a quick look at persisting data by using data volumes, and that's probably the most common way you're going to persist data externally. You can also, if you have files, you can, an actual MDF file, you can copy that into a container or even into a volume if you want. And the other thing that's important to know is you don't always have to start from scratch with Microsoft's image or the base image of whatever database you're using. You can build your own image that on top of that, right? You use the base for your image, and then you can do whatever it is that you need to do in there. So here, for example, I'm running a bunch of scripts that will do things like make changes to the server, adding users or permissions, different things, maybe even creating some little test databases, or maybe copying a file into there after the fact. And another really important thing that you need to know that you can do is coordinate containers, data containers, with other containers, like with your app containers, etc., using Docker Compose. And I actually did a session on that for DockerCon Live, and it's on YouTube, and there's the shortened URL for that, bit.ly/SQL Docker. So 15 minutes. Here's some resources. Quick, take a screenshot. Just kidding. This presentation is on my GitHub repository at github.com, Julie Lerman, SQL Docker. I'm Julie Lerman, and thanks again for joining me at the Docker Community All Hands.